So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the next webinar organized by ELSEC, and today in collaboration with our partners from Privacy Salon and some other partners that are co-organizing the GDPR Salon. So this is our second webinar of the day and the fourth one of this week, where we'll be giving a perspective on cybersecurity and privacy experts from their homes, from their salon, in today's session, of course, in relation to GDPR Salon. Today and during the next Thursdays, towards the end of, let's say, the next month and a half to 2 months, we'll be focusing on data protection and privacy, specifically trends in relation to GDPR, obviously e-privacy, and other important things in relation to privacy and data protection. We have a special topic for today to kick this off, and that's of course something that has been hitting us in the last couple of weeks quite significantly, COVID-19, and then specifically the expected privacy preserving proximity tracing technologies, or the COVID apps as we could also call them. And we have a special speaker for that during this afternoon, namely Bart Preneel, who has been very much involved in the discussions here in Belgium and also on Europe-wide in that respect. But before doing so and handing over the floor to Bart, let me give you a bit of perspective on why we do this. So we are planning to organize a GDPR Salon. It has been scheduled to take place on 26th of May, but unfortunately we'll have to defer that to a later stage, hopefully still this year, because we think it's still very important and necessary for privacy experts and people, organizations to find out about developments in GDPR, data protection and related, and figuring out how to deal with this in a best practices way. So GDPR Salon 2020 will be postponed, but in the meantime, we'll be working on different of the topics in order to make sure that our community of interested people and experts can continue also receiving interesting updates and insights in GDPR developments. So as from today, every week from your own salon and in your own salon, we'll be organizing different sessions. Sometimes they will be informative sessions, sometimes they can be trainings. GDPR Salon is a co-organization of a number of organizations, in this case Privacy Salon, CPDP organizers, and VUB, ELSEC, and VVSG, which is the organization for communities here in Belgium. We have a couple of supporters already for Privacy Salon, the upcoming one, namely OmniPrivacy. A couple of words about ELSEC, the organizers of today's session. We are a non-for-profit association, already established since 2002, so nearly 20 years now, bringing together expertise from both industry as well as academia, research and innovation, and working together with quite a number of end users in figuring out what challenges companies have in terms of their information and their digital security. So we bring together this expertise and, like in today's session, provide some insights in current trends, evolutions, challenges, and opportunities, while at the same time organizing different types of new types of activities. Like, for instance, this is a project that we're running together with some partners, focusing on cybersecurity for robotics. And many of these types of applications we have running together with some of our partners. So you're welcome to join ELSEC, welcome to join our webinars, which are taking place every Tuesday morning at 9 and at noon. So both on cybersecurity trends themselves, from cybersecurity experts themselves. At noon, it's industrial cybersecurity. And then today, this morning, we focused on identity and access management, which we will be doing in the next Thursdays in the morning. And then, of course, in the noon sessions on data protection. So these slides and overviews you will be also finding online after today, because this recording is going to be published on our website, and you will be able to watch it afterwards again and to figure out, okay, which sessions are supposed to be taking place, but also to listen out on some of the webinars we've already done and to get some insights on, for instance, the topics that we have addressed earlier this morning and last Tuesday. For the next upcoming ones, next week we'll be discussing highly likely the cookie consent management, something that has been prepared by some of our partners in relation to the also postponed InfoSecurity trade show. We'll be showing some best practices in GDPR compliance management, and then some developments together with the Belgian Data Protection Authority, and seeking further how that is being put into practice. But for now, let me introduce to you Bart Preneel, who has been quite significantly in the press this week. I don't think that we haven't had any newspaper in Belgium, at least, that hasn't done a publication with Bart. Of course, asking his expertise and advice on what we should be expecting from COVID apps, and how they should be able either to protect us, but maybe also how we need to protect ourselves from those apps. So Bart, I'm going to give you the floor. Please highlight us and indulge us with your expertise in the privacy preserving, but then still COVID apps.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. Is it working fine?
It is working fine.
Okay. So good afternoon to all of you. I hope you're doing well, shielding in place at home. So today I want to talk to you about privacy preserving proximity tracing. So, of course, we are facing the Corona crisis. Every one of us is sitting at home, and maybe we're even getting bored. So there is lots of people who have the right idea to use technology and to create apps to actually deal with this crisis. And some apps just give us information about the disease, about epidemiology, new things we learn, new cures, plans for a vaccine, and so on. There is some apps which are more ambitious and go into the self-diagnosis. Some apps offer to collect medical information, and some apps offer to use location-based techniques to help us deal with quarantine and getting out of quarantine. So interestingly, if you go to your phone and you enter Corona in the App Store, I think Google has actually made some filtering, because the only apps you get to see are those of the WHO. So there is so many apps that probably they want to put some filter on this and avoid that some apps that actually would need medical approval actually are being distributed. So as I mentioned, there is apps for self-diagnosis. On the left, we see an app which was distributed in Korea. On the right, you see a website, not an app, but a website by our colleagues from VUB that help you at home to identify whether or not you're infected and what you should do. So some apps try to collect medical data. I just highlight two initiatives here. The one on the left, which is reviewed on the website of Corona apps, because there is so many, there is now already websites reviewing Corona apps from the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. This is the counterpart of Cienzano, I think, in Belgium, but probably even more focused on research. So they actually offer to take data from your Fit watches and your fitness devices and collect all this data, and to use this actually to detect symptoms and behavior of Corona patients. On the right, we see an app from Cambridge project, Cambridge in the UK, where they actually try to use the microphone and then some AI on your device to analyze your cough and analyze your voice to determine whether or not you're infected. So these two apps, they collect medical data, they use it for research purposes. They don't diagnose you online or in real time, but they actually try to collect this data, and based on your health information, they try to make diagnosis work better and maybe try to also measure the spread of the epidemiology. So the Corona crisis has, of course, stimulated creativity. To give you an idea, at the end of February in South Korea, 5 coronaviruses related apps, so 5 coronavirus related apps ranked in the top 10 of the apps in Google Play Store, so about half of them. And as we can see in the pictures, somewhere about location of infections and somewhat even about trajectories of infected people. So what Korea did is they actually, if there was somebody was infected, they actually used the app on their phone to detect the traces where they had been, which supermarkets, where they traveled, and then they made this information public, which of course is gave rise to problems. People were actually stigmatized based on it, got problems with their neighbors, and so on. So this is definitely not an approach we want to take in Europe, because it's very privacy invasive. And there's lots of problems. Also in China, there have been over 300 apps. You may have seen on TV the apps with the color green, orange, or red that decide whether or not you can take the train or even leave your neighborhood. But all in all, it was also a very distributed approach. There were several hundred apps doing different things. One thing you can do with location data is aggregate this data and then analyze how people are behaving, how much the quarantine is being followed up. I know this is happening in several countries, including Belgium. So the operators have given the cell data, which is more or less low resolution location data. So it's only within a few hundred meters or a few kilometers. They have aggregated this and given this to the government to study actually whether people stick to quarantine. What I did, I don't have access to the results of this analysis, and this analysis does not deal with individual people. What I showed you here is the results of the analysis of Google. Google does something similar based on our smartphones. And for example, studies that we went 79% less to events for retail and recreation, 20% less in parks, 20% more in residential, and 47% less in workplaces. So you also want to maybe use individual location techniques to do things. For example, maybe you want to monitor whether people stick to quarantine, individual people, because we're told that we should not make non-essential movements. We shouldn't go to places where we're not supposed to be. And of course, our cell phones could be used for this. Of course, it would not be very secure because you could just go there without your cell phone and then the system wouldn't detect this. But this is somewhat privacy invasive. And so this could be used for monitoring compliance with quarantine rules. A second thing, which I have not seen in Belgium, but I guess it's probably more happening in bigger cities, is that you use GPS location in the phone, you collect all this information and you figure out which places are crowded and you tell people to avoid those places. So this is voluntary. It's somewhat privacy invasive depending on how this information is being stored and collected. But today we speak about proximity tracing because COVID-19 disease is communicated through direct contact. The numbers from Israel suggest that about 20% come from the surface, 80% comes from over-the-air transmission or transmission between people. And so the idea is that if we can use our phone technology, either GPS or Bluetooth, to find out who was close to whom, we can actually trace the progress of infection and actually hopefully stop it. So this is an approach we actually use also in the physical world. All countries have such a system in place called contact tracing, which means that if somebody is infected, you will actually talk to this person, try to find out what all their contacts were in the past days, and then contact all those people. This is, of course, privacy invasive, but it's not large-scale mass surveillance because you have to do it one by one. And of course, this approach has limitations. First, it's slow. And second, if you sit for half hour next to somebody in a train or a bus, you may not know the name of this person. And maybe you can tell the tracer that you were next to somebody on a bus, but if you remember that, but you can't give them the contact information because you don't have it. So COVID-19 is a specific problem, which some diseases have as well, but it seems to be particularly serious with COVID-19 that, of course, most of us, as we learned this morning, 97% of the Belgians didn't have an infection. It's apparently, based on this result of the University of Antwerp, only 3% of us have show immunity or at least show a response to the coronavirus. So most of us are not infected yet, but some people are actually infected and contagious but have no symptoms. Apparently, some people even never get symptoms, or it takes a while, several days, before you get symptoms, and then finally you actually get symptoms. And of course, when the symptoms get serious enough, you may go to a doctor, get tested, and decide hopefully get treatment. So this means that if you do nothing, then we can go to the first point, and of course, one person is infected, and then I was trying to get a pointer here. Yes, okay. So one person is infected, and then of course he will spread his neighbors, which don't show signals, or the people he got in contact with, and then they will become ill, and so this is how the disease spreads. Now, if you just do normal contact tracing and you're not fast enough, Well, it means the problem is then that people will actually spread the infection. The people who actually got the infection will spread it further before they get symptoms, and you will always be too late. And I think this is something which we apparently have seen, because apparently in most countries in the world, we were not able to control the infection, and we got this exponential growth. And the only way to stop this so far has been to tell people to stay at home, to create a full or a partial lockdown. So the idea is, can we actually be faster and detect as soon as somebody has symptoms, detect who they've been in contact with and warn those people and tell them to quarantine. That's the philosophy of the idea, to have a faster way to quarantine people or self-isolate or even treat them. So as I described on the previous slide, what we've been doing so far is manual contact tracing via interviews. And based on this, you identify all the contacts and you follow up. What you have to do then depends on the state of the epidemic, on how serious it is. So should they be at home or quarantine? Should we wait until they can be tested? Maybe some people should not be tested because we don't have the capacity, and so on. So I think the big question here is speed. And the big question also is, what with people you don't know? So people maybe you stood too close in a supermarket queue because it was a very crowded supermarket, but you don't know the name of this person, or in a bus. So this contact tracing only works if the number of infections is limited. Obviously, if 10% of the population is infected, then it's almost impossible to find out who's infected by this person and then quarantine them. And ideally, this is something which is more a medical question, so I'm not an expert, but some epidemiologists say you also need sufficient testing capacity. Of course, if you can convince people to just stay at home for long enough, maybe you don't need testing capacity, but it may be tricky if somebody has no symptoms and you tell them to stay at home for 10 days because we think you're infected. Will people actually do this? I think that's an interesting question. So why do we want to use technology? Not because we think technology is great and we have technology and people should use it, but we know that manual contact tracing has failed and we hope that technology can help. Are we sure? I don't think so, but we want to find out who was at risk. We want to encourage them, depending on availability of tests and depending on the advice of epidemiologists, to quarantine. Something else we want to do is contribute information to epidemiological research. So epidemiologists want to find out how the disease spreads. For example, the information we have that in Israel is that 20% of cases come from contact surfaces. This is something you can do with proximity tracing research, because you can actually, there's 20% of the cases you cannot explain by people-to-people transmissions. So it's definitely not the goal to replace manual tracing. Manual tracing will still keep happening. And if you've seen the press in Belgium, many tracers have been hired recently. So the government wants to strengthen the efforts there, but we hope that we can complement and augment it by making it more effective and faster. And whether it's going to work, I think if you have to be very honest, we don't know. We know that in the first phase of the epidemic, the manual tracing failed. There can be problems with false positives, which means you're standing for 15 minutes close to somebody, but there is a plastic screening between. Can we detect this? And if not, we'll actually create a false positive. A false negative is that somehow you stay for very short times, maybe very close to somebody, or maybe via surface contact you get infected, and so we'll not detect this. So I think this is a problem, we don't know, but I guess the question is, can we afford to do nothing? Because it seems that if at this moment only 3% of people are potentially immune, that it can take a very long time before we get rid of this virus. And we would like to get rid of lockdown measures, and we hope that proximity tracing can help to get out of that faster. So as I mentioned already, in Korea and also in Israel, they've used geolocation. So in Israel, they even asked Google very nicely to actually provide location information of the people. I assume that Korea has done similar things. There is a fundamental problem with geolocation data, which is it works to some extent. So as I said, there is a problem of resolution, that it doesn't work inside buildings. So that's a major problem. The other problem is privacy. So of course, governments can store all this location data centrally and then do an analysis to see who was nearby. The problem is that even if you remove the name of the person or the phone number, in fact, 4 space-time points identify you with 95% probability. And if there's 25 space-time points, the probability is 99.9999. What does it mean? More or less, if I know where you are at 8 in the morning or 7 in the morning when you wake up, if I know at 9 o'clock where you drop your kids off at school or at the kindergarten. If I know where you are at work, usually at 11, and I know where you're in the sports club or the bar at 8 o'clock, well, then I know more or less who you are, because there is no one else in the whole, in Belgium or even in Europe who is at those locations 4 times of the day. And so the problem with geolocation is that it actually is always re-identifiable. It doesn't give you privacy guarantees. It actually provides the person or the database a way to re-identify everybody. So if we want to actually use proximity tracing, we should respect privacy. We don't want a central database that can reconstruct a social graph, which means everybody you have interacted with or where you have been. So what we want to do is we want to find out who you have been close to and for how long. And for epidemiologists, you want to find out how is this overall graph. So overall, I've been in contact with the following people, I've been in contact with the following people, without names, with pseudonyms, but you want to know how this pattern is, with how many people everybody has been in contact for sufficiently long duration. As I said, we want to protect identities, and we also want to have the right to forget. So we want to give you the right to erase your data, to maybe only show part of the data. Maybe you've been to a certain place, you don't want to be known, you should be able to remove this. And also this database should, as we will see in the solution we propose, actually the database destroys itself after a few weeks, which I think is a very nice property. If you're going to deploy such a system, you may always have people who try to take advantage of this. For example, what you could do is, if you have a grudge against your employer or against your school, you could actually go there on purpose, stand very close to many people for a long time, and then afterwards fakely report that you're infected. And at that moment, all those people would actually have to go home. And so you actually want to make sure that only people who really got certified by a doctor that they're infected, that they can actually upload reports and start to trace. You need enough accuracy, so you actually have to cover all the people, so not have false negatives and false positives. We discussed this already. It should be scalable, so we want to use this in countries with millions of people or even tens of millions of people. Ideally, we want a European solution with hundreds of millions of people. So this means we should be able to roll it out quickly. We don't want to start developing completely new ideas in the sense that we're going to use new communication technologies. We're going to really change something to mobile phones. We're going to give every user a device. These things will take months to roll out. We want to use the basic functions which are present in the common smartphones. And of course, very important as well is we want the system to be voluntary. Because if you force this or mandate this, people will find many ways to bypass it. You can put your phone in airplane mode. You can leave your phone at home. You can swap your SIM card. There's so many ways you can bypass this. You can put your phone in the metal box, so that if you're going to mandate this, you actually have created millions of enemies who will try to undermine your system. So I think it's not a smart idea to do this. Such a system, of course, needs enough uptake to work. And as scientists, we have to be very honest, we don't know how high this uptake has to be. We suspect that 10% is not enough. We think that 80% is enough, but where the tipping point is unclear. It also depends, of course, if, for example, many people in specific cities, if you get in specific cities a high threshold, then it would also be sufficient to probably control the epidemic at the national level. If you can get the key cities, if you can get critical numbers there, because there is, of course, more interactions in cities than in the countryside. But as scientists, we have to be very honest, we don't know whether we need 30% or 70% or 50%. This is something we'll only find out when we have built the app and see whether it works. So one of my old students, Professor Carmela Troncoso, she's working in privacy. She's now professor in EPFL in Switzerland. And she started on an idea how to do this. And so her work is on privacy. And so she looked at all the apps that are being proposed. And as you've seen in Belgium, there have been dozens, but at the European scale, there have been hundreds. And she looked just like me in horror to how these apps are all privacy violating, because they collect location data in central databases. And they collect, like the Singapore app, they collect Bluetooth data in central databases. And they, in general, put in place a system of mass surveillance. So her idea was, can we actually put up such a system, proximity tracing, without creating a central database? And so this is a high-level overview of the system. I will not go into any cryptographic details today, but more or less, you download the app. The app inside the phone generates a key, which normally stays inside the phone. And with this key, you generate ephemeral identifiers. On this slide, they're called EBIT, so they're just random numbers. And your phone starts broadcasting in Bluetooth random numbers, say every 10, 15 seconds. This is quite reasonable in terms of power consumption. It's a broadcast, so we don't make connection between phones. It just broadcasts a random string of 128 bits over Bluetooth. So, and of course, all the phones are doing this. So as a phone, you record, you send yourself your random identifiers. Those identifiers change every 15 minutes because otherwise it's possible to trace a phone based on the identifier. If a phone would always send the same number all the time, then of course you would be able to trace that phone. But so in our solution, we want maximal privacy. So every 15 minutes, this number changes. And so what the phone does is it broadcasts numbers, and it also picks up the numbers it receives from people and just store this in the phone. It doesn't store the location where it picked this up. It doesn't store the exact time. It may store it was in the morning on Thursday or in the afternoon on Thursday, and then the number it received. It may add some data like signal strength. So this is something which comes out of the Bluetooth interface. How strong was the signal to distinguish between somebody that stood 30 meters away, because Bluetooth can go that far, and somebody who stood 10 or 3 meters away or 2 meters away. So there is ways to measure this, especially if you have multiple measurements. So then, unfortunately, one of these users, user A, actually starts getting symptoms, feels a bit sick, goes to the doctor, gets tested, and Alice finds out she's actually infected. So when she goes at the doctor's, what happens is that actually some authentication takes place. At this moment, the central infrastructure doesn't know anything about these identifiers. There's no identification information. It has no keys. It has, in fact, there is no database yet. But at the moment that Alice is tested positive, at that moment, she actually gets an authorization token. And with this token, she will upload in the backend, in a central server, her secret key, which she used to generate her tokens for the past days. So this actually will allow you to go back. And so this is just put in a public database. This public database does not keep track of IP addresses. We will actually remove those with some proxy or a mixed network. And so it just has random identifiers and a period, so a time at which Alice believes she was first, or the doctor has said that Alice was first infectious. So the first symptoms, or maybe a few days before. What happens next is that hopefully there are not too many of those Alices, but I think in Belgium it's like 1,000 a day. So they upload their keys, and all the apps will actually go to the backend a few times a day and download all those keys and check which keys fit with the identifiers they have recorded. So if you have a key, you can check whether this key generated this identifier, and in this way you can check whether you actually have seen these beacons, this EBID, so it's, as it's called, EBITs from infected phones. So you can take into this calculation into account how many you've seen, how many times you've seen this person, or how close the interaction was. So based on the signal strength, inside your phone, a calculation will be done, and based on this, it will be decided, yes, you may have a risk for infection. If that happens, then the phone will give you a warning. What happens then depends on the country. Maybe the phone will just tell you, we think you're infected, please go in quarantine. Maybe the phone will say, please go see a test at a nearby testing agency, go get a test. Maybe the phone will say, enter your phone number, and somebody will call you to actually discuss what the next steps are. So this is how the contact tracing is being automated. Now, if you design such a system, the devil is in the details. It sounds, in principle, I think it's a very nice approach. There is just a central database with keys which are not linked to people, and only the keys of infected people end up in the database. So if you're not infected, you never even store everything in the database. So obviously, this cannot be used to surveil you. The only thing that can use to surveil you is actually the things you send out, but those are random numbers that keep changing all the time. So that doesn't tell anything about your either. But there is many details. I don't want to go too much into the fine details, but what do you store where, which dates you add to things, what the time resolution is, what the order is in which you send your codes, because you may generate them in one order and broadcast them in a different order. If you upload a key to the central database, in fact, everybody can see, oh, this person uploaded a key, so this person must be infected. So what we're going to do is every phone will upload every 6 hours something into the database, and only the infected people will upload the key, and the other people will upload some empty message that looks the same because it's encrypted. And so there is many fine details to put in place to make sure that if you can really make the system very privacy friendly. The system is quite scalable. So we estimate that the amount of storage needed on an app is about 4 megabytes. And every day you need to download 30 kilobytes per 1,000 infections per day. So even if you would have 100,000 infections, it would still be feasible. It would be something like a couple of megabytes you have to download. But I think in a smaller country, I think in Belgium, we're in this kind of order of magnitude, a few thousand infections per day. So a few tens of kilobytes, maybe 100 kilobytes of download. There is another nice feature in DP-3T. So DP-3T, by the way, stands for distributed privacy preserving proximity tracing. And distributed means we have no central database. We still have this backend that distributed keys, but there is no database with any personal information, with things that pertain to a user, tokens received, phone numbers. Some of the phone numbers are only used by the health infrastructure to contact you. But as long as you're not infected, the app doesn't know your phone number, doesn't know your name, doesn't know anything unique. So there is an opt-in feature in the system that also the user can say, I want to share more information. So every day I'm going to upload a bit which says I'm infected or not. And with the keys of infected users you have seen, how many times you've seen them, and how long you've seen them since the first infection day, since they got notified. So this is information you can actually store. And this goes to a separate database for epidemiologists to analyze. This would be opt-in. So if you don't want this, your app would not send this information. So we also made improvements, but I don't want to go too much into the details. But the idea would be that you generate, instead of one key and many codes, you actually generate many keys, and then you upload many keys to the server. The server then doesn't download all these, put all those keys to all the phone, because that would be too much, but it creates a filter, a test, which you can check whether you have a set of keys, a large set of keys, 100,000 of keys, and you produce a filter, a piece of program, a simple test. You can put every received Bluetooth token in there, and it will say yes or no, this is one of the keys in there. So it's actually more privacy preserving because you cannot link the different tokens sent by one user. It's a bit more tricky to explain, so I will skip the details. But there is a white paper online where you can read the details. The storage on the phone is 50% more. The download is a bit higher. It's about 3 megabytes per 1,000 infections per day. So it's still feasible, especially for a small country. If there is many infections, I think the mobile operators will have to do some extra effort to give you data. There is other tricks you can apply. For example, instead of sending your code, you can actually split your code in pieces and send every 10 seconds a piece. And only if you have received enough pieces of the code, you can piece it together. And this actually is more privacy friendly. And it kind of inherently detects that you have seen enough code. So you have to have less. It's a different technique of doing it, which actually gives more privacy. Because if you collect only one share by just passing by, you actually learn nothing about even the code, individual code. You need enough pieces to actually be able to reconstruct the peak. And that's another trick we added to our system. So on the right, you see the DP-3T infrastructure, which consists just of an app that generates keys and broadcast stuff, that downloads, that collects these tokens. In case of infection, actually uploads a key in a database, just a backend, but there is no names, no identifiers, okay? And then of course there is the interface with the health system, because the health system has to decide whether somebody is infected or not, and has to give you an authorization code to allow you to upload your key. To prevent that somebody malicious can do this, a healthy person can upload their key and actually make people worried unnecessarily. So we try to separate those very clearly. So DP-3T does not deal with medical information in that sense. It doesn't deal with case management or treatment. It just actually deals with keys that tell you whether you've been close to somebody or not and for how long. And it also makes it very easy if multiple countries, so you may have seen the announcement, but yesterday, Switzerland and Austria announced they would both roll out DP-3T as a solution. And so in fact, Switzerland and Austria can exchange these keys with each other. And so people who travel from one country to the other could actually easily use a system in both countries. The system would be interoperable. And the only exchange between Switzerland and Austria is just some random keys with no names, no locations, no beacons. So it's only very minimal information, and it doesn't violate any privacy. So many people have worked on this. So it's not just, I would say, one smart guy. Like many other apps, they have one smart guy who thinks out of a system And then there is some very good developers that make a very cool app. This is actually a system where more than 30 scientists have been working on for a month to think about all the fine points and all the details. So we have very long reports available describing the system, but also a few days ago, a very detailed security and privacy analysis was published. And I will show you some screenshots from this to show you this is not something where, you know, a bright guy thought for a week. This is actually some of the best, smartest people I know in the world have been spending 4 weeks on this to look, really there is no holes and no problems, okay? So this, the whole thing is based on data minimization. Nothing leaves the phone unless what you really need. It prevents function creep. So once you have a system in place, you cannot use it for anything else. So as I will show you on the next slide, there is also more centralized systems where the government then can say, oh, proximity tracking, we can now detect who actually violated quarantine. We can also detect who was actually close to this crime, maybe a murder took place or a burglary. We can actually use this system to find out. So our system is completely unsuitable for this. It can only do one thing, which is proximity testing and find how disease spreads among people. So non-infected users never upload any information. And they never even give in the app their identity number, their phone number, nothing. The app knows nothing and just sends out random numbers. And so the system will also gracefully come to an end, because if nobody is infected, then people stop uploading the keys. And after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, these keys become irrelevant because you're not infectious for longer. That's at least what the doctors tell us now. So after 3 weeks, these keys are deleted from the database. And so more or less, if the last infected user is reported, 3 weeks later, the database will be empty and the whole system will do nothing anymore. And then it can be stopped. So you don't need anybody to explicitly delete data in some sense. The central database only has keys that are expire by themselves over 3 weeks, and there is no sensitive data anyway. So this is a very nice feature. This is why it's called decentralized. By making it decentralized, decisions are made on the phone, and this increases a little bit, but it's only in a limited way the risk that somebody puts out a Bluetooth antenna and starts collecting a lot of these identifiers, and then later on looks in the database and sees whether he actually saw infected identifiers. So this is possible, but as I will show you on the next slides, all proximity tracing systems have such features. So we have to also accept that even if you build the ideal system, it will always leak information. So I think it's a societal decision whether or not we want to leak this information or not, and whether we want to accept this. But I think there is a very big difference between mass surveillance, where there is a large database that can leak, that can be breached, that can be abused by governments for other purposes, or a system where somebody can actually locally put up a camera and a Bluetooth antenna and start spying on people. Because if you want to spy on people today, you can also put cameras and you can use Wi-Fi detection and you can use many other techniques. So we don't want to make a system that is much more efficient available. So what this slide tries to do is try to explain you the Singapore approach to tracing. And this is also the variants of those are being put together by the PEPP-PT consortium in Germany and by Robert. Robert is a French system, which is also part of PEPP-PT. This is an INRIA system. And they use very similar components, but in a different way. And maybe I should explain you the Singapore system. That's the one easiest to explain. In Singapore, the government generates a key for every user. With this, they generate your FIDs. So they generate your codes and you download your codes in the phone. So this is a big difference. The government has the key of everybody and the government knows which phones has sent which codes. Or if they see, let me put it differently, if they see a code, they know which user it belongs to. Okay. The normal operation is the same, which means phones just broadcast these Bluetooth beacons and they record them. But then if somebody is infected, you don't upload your key, you actually upload all the Bluetooth beacons you have received. And then the government ends up with a huge database of all those Bluetooth tokens. So for every infected user, they will have thousands of Bluetooth tokens. And then the government will analyze this database and find out who of those is infected. And they will get a warning. So the centralized database actually here knows a lot of information also about non-infected users, because their information, which is their tokens that an infected person received, end up in a central database. And the government knows with a key who belongs to which code. So in that sense, there is much more risk, because if this would be leaked, if this database with keys owned by the government and these locations would be leaked, then you would know where everybody was at a certain time. more or less. Everybody was in contact with an infected person. So that's more or less how the system works. So you have more upload here, but you have less, you have no download because you only have to tell somebody we think you're infected. And of course, another thing is that people want to use AI and they want to do analysis on all these databases to find out things. Epidemiologists hope that they will be able to control the disease better. Some epidemiologists, some other people say, well, it's going to be more privacy invasive and it's not clear this will learn us more than what we need actually in a decentralized solution. So from our report, and I will not go into detail, we made a very detailed analysis. So we have actually two proposals. The low cost proposal is the one I explained, and the one with the Kukel filters, where there is more keys and a slightly different thing. And then you have the centralized approach. And so we look at several privacy attacks. And the bottom line is that if it's about learning from who was close to whom or who was interacting with whom or where people are, that actually decentralized approaches are way better. And actually centralized approaches, the backend can do actually, has much more information and much more at risk of backend attacks. For privacy of local attacks, some of the local attacks, especially those with antennas, work slightly better than local attacks in the centralized system, but that should be compensated by the fact that in the centralized system, actually government level or national databases can actually do much more. So in terms of security risks, so the fact that somebody can upload fake contacts, suppress contacts, or prevent contact discovery, I think both approaches are comparable, with this difference that, of course, if the sample decision is made, centrally, the central government can, of course, always suppress decisions as well, which is not possible in decentralized approaches. So I know this is too small to read probably for most of you, but so I'm very pleased with the document that, and I put you the link there. At risks, I think it's very interesting to understand that actually proximity tracing always brings privacy risks. For example, for any proximity tracing, also one based on location or any other technique, any digital system, you can always, there is techniques to identify infected individuals. Just the trick is very simple. You just buy 20 phones, and then you bring certain phones in contact with certain people, and then you see what messages you get. In the end, you will know which people were infected. That's more or less the high-level idea of the attack. That always works no matter what you do. If somebody is really willing to find out things in such a system, well, they just buy many phones, and then they make contacts with several people with different configurations of phones, and then they can find out, based on the reports they get on those phones, who was infected. So this is an important message that something like this we cannot stop. If you don't want such an attack, well, we should just go back to manual tracing, which have other problems. Okay, so location of infected people, if you use Bluetooth, any solution may allow a local attacker who is very motivated, who uses an antenna and uses a camera in combination and so on, the kind of specific setup, they can find out who actually in the neighborhood is infected. So I don't want to say too much about this. Maybe one side comment is that there is quite some Bluetooth infrastructures in place. I don't know how much in Belgium, but at least in the US, in some other countries in Europe. For example, in shopping malls to track users, maybe government should ask that during the epidemic, those systems are disabled because they may interfere badly with use of Bluetooth beacons for proximity tracing. So false alarms are also possible in all the systems. So I think it's very important to understand that some risks are generic and are always there. And this is what we point out in the report. And specific risks, so again, I'm not going to show you the details, but you can read this in our report. But the bottom line is you have here decentralized systems where you share less information, then you have slightly more worries about local attacks. Centralized systems, then you have more attacks by the central server. So this is a different way to represent the information I gave you before. I don't have time to go into all these attacks. That would be a lecture of many hours. But if you're interested, you can read this report. And I hope you appreciate that dozens of scientists have spent weeks and weeks to make a detailed analysis. So I think this is some information we didn't have at all. Even at I think, end of February, the world of science did not understand all these issues and these constraints we have today. So I think that's a good thing. If anything good comes out of this, even if the app doesn't work, we now understand much better what the constraints are, what can be done, what cannot be done. So now go to the latest developments. So about a week ago, Google and Apple announced that they want to support proximity tracing. And one of the reasons why this was necessary is that actually it turns out that most Bluetooth apps don't work on iOS, because iOS is worried about your privacy, which means that an app in the background cannot send Bluetooth broadcast signals. So this means if you want to use any Bluetooth-based proximity detection solution on an iPhone, you have to put the app in the foreground and you have to prevent that the iPhone locks. So you have to deactivate the locking mechanism. So it's bad for your battery, it's inconvenient, because of course you have to have the app in the foreground, and of course it's also a privacy and security risk, because at that moment you lose your phone, then actually the phone is not locked and there is full access. So there is other reasons why you want help from Google and Apple, because they actually have low-level access to the Bluetooth radios. And so as an academic consortium or an industry consortium, you only have access to the standard interfaces. You can get the received signal strength, but not more. And there is more information potentially available in the radio that can help you detect proximity. So what Google and Apple have announced is that somewhere in the beginning of May, they will have an application programming interface, an API, that actually will support more or less decentralized proximity tracing. But if you have a centralized solution, then they don't want to give you access to the API. So they only want to support a few apps per country, and they only want to support decentralized apps. Okay, so, and the DP-3T team is actually working very closely with Google and Apple to make sure that what they offer for API actually is working with our solution. For example, our enhanced scheme was not yet included in their solution. So I don't know whether you've been following the press, but there has been a huge debate and a huge controversy, and this is where I want to end. I want to leave some time for questions. But more or less, the DP-PT consortium had joined forces with our friends of Fraunhofer and many other partners in Germany to make a pan-European solution. It was called the PEPP-PT consortium. But it turned out that I think after several weeks, there was kind of a big difference of opinion. The German consortium absolutely positively wanted a centralized approach, and the Swiss researchers and all the academics around that wanted a decentralized approach. And there was kind of no way we could find a compromise. There was also no obvious sign that PEPP-PT was willing to offer support for both. There was also a different in vision, in the sense that DP-3T, we made a GitHub site, which means all our documents, all our security analysis, privacy analysis, related work, cartoons, whatever, code, everything is available there. Already more than a week, our first alpha version of the apps for iOS and Android is there. If you look at the German approach, the PEPP-PT or the INRIA approach, only last Saturday, after a lot of pressure, they actually released some documents, and the code is still not available. And it's not even clear the code will be ever openly available. So it's a very different philosophy. Transparency for DP-3T, more like we know what is good for you and we will trust that. So I think this is what happened. As a consequence, over the weekend, two political developments happened. The DP-3T consortium left PEPP-PT because we said we don't feel fairly represented. For example, also last Friday, PEPP-PT gave a press conference without inviting us, and they talked to governments without inviting us, without even telling us what they would say, or without inviting us or helping us to shape our message. So they were clearly going behind our backs and trying to push a centralized approach with all the governments and suppress the decentralized approach. Also, they removed the link to our website and so on. So it was really an ugly week and a very sad weekend. As a response, 500 scientists signed a letter saying you should go for a decentralized approach. This happened in the beginning of this week. And as you may have seen, Switzerland and Austria actually have announced yesterday that they will go for a centralized approach. So as a consequence of this controversy, there is a big debate now in Germany, France, Italy, where the government wanted to push a centralized approach, and now civil society, some academics actually pushing for a decentralized approach, and we will see how it works out. In the UK, it's very simple. The NHS will decide it's a centralized approach, and the government has already asked information to be able for them to identify people in the database. That's already there, that's reported. So they really go for a surveillance state, and Corona apps will just be the perfect excuse to enhance the surveillance state. So it's getting very ugly. It's also clear that these systems will not interoperate. The centralized approach also has the problem that if you as a French citizen would go to Germany, that actually Germany gets a lot of access on your information, all your contacts you have in France or vice versa. So if you want to make this operate at a global scale, if you start sharing with other governments these identifiers, these random numbers, then governments know who you've talked to while you were visiting the other country. While in the DP-3T approach, the only thing you share are keys, and those keys, again, they're random numbers. They don't tell anything about your identity, about your location, about your interactions. So I think this is a fundamental difference, and we will see how the battle works out in the coming days. So this is what I wanted to say. So I'm so pleased I can be part of this team. There's many bright people part of the DP-3T team, also from my group. But the main driving forces is Professor Camila Troncoso, my old student in the PFL, also some bright scientists in ETH. In total, we have 10 countries. You see here the names of the academics, but there is also dozens of other people commenting. There is people writing code. And again, all this code is available on GitHub. All our documents are available on GitHub. You can raise issues on GitHub, and you can discuss. You can, if we respond, we think we should do it like this because of this reason, then you can answer, and there's lots of open discussions. I think 200 issues have been raised in GitHub, and all the code is released under Mozilla public license. So maybe to come back to the controversy, so the PEPP-PT proposal, the centralized proposal, now have a major problem. So Germany, France, and UK is that their app will not work on iOS because Google refuses to open their interface to decentralized solutions. And so this is highly controversial. And so more or less now there is high pressure being put by governments from France and Germany on Google and Apple to open the interface to them as well. But of course now the Americans are saying, what is this? You first give us very big fines to Google and Apple, especially Google got very big fines in France for violating privacy rules. And now, a few months later, you come to us and say, please give us access to a centralized system with location information on our citizens so we can spy on our citizens. So it's kind of very interesting that France takes very inconsequential positions. So large companies apparently should protect privacy rules, and I fully agree with that. I think actually we should sometimes be tougher on the big giants. But in this case, when they choose the side of privacy, they choose the side of a decentralized solution, a privacy-friendly solution, which we needed to be acceptable. Now suddenly the governments from these large countries are saying, oh, no, we want actually to have detailed information on our citizens. So it's kind of some interesting irony here in this debate. And that's what I want to say. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Bart. That was quite insightful, very concise, but still very in-depth, as we are used to know from you. We are getting quite a lot of comments and interaction from the audience, and that's interesting to see. You can already take a look to it yourself, Bart, on the chat box. You'll see that there's actually being a lot of demand about potential of DLTs, blockchain technology. So a specific question was in relation to your slide number 17, the use of DP-3T, and is it based on blockchain? I think you actually already answered it, but maybe you could specify a little bit more why not the use of DLTs in this case.
Blockchain and DLTs are fantastic ideas. They solve an open problem in computer science for more than 30 years, how to achieve consensus with many distributed systems. They also solve another problem, is how to make information verifiable and non-removable. I think in this case, we have to have information that's removable. We don't want a blockchain because medical data like this, interaction data, who we talk to, who was infectious and so on, this data should disappear as soon as the infection is gone. So we don't want a blockchain here at all. We just need authorizations. We want ephemeral IDs. We want the opposite, actually. We want temporary stuff to temporarily deal with temporary interactions, and then afterwards forget about all this, and hopefully in a year or a year and a half, we can go on with our lives and have nothing remaining of everything we did in the past 18 months.
Perfect, thank you. Also from a similar perspective, there was a bit of concern on the involvement of Google and Apple. I think you also explained that. So what would be the relationship from Google and Apple in DP-3T in this case? Are they involved as direct partners, or basically anybody within DP-3T is on the same level? And is DP-3T some form of organization, or is it just a number of independent researchers, as in your case?
Okay, so let me answer this. DP-3T is in the process of creating an organization. We were first joining PEPP-PT, but in fact, they also don't have a formal organization yet. It's an ad hoc consortium with no clear governance at this moment. Also, DP-3T, we actually are working on this, and we'll make a proposal. It will be a not-for-profit, obviously. And at this moment, we actually, although we get quite some interest of large companies, we're not clear we want to have them involved in general to steer how this will develop. So of course, we're very happy. Anybody can contribute, anybody can comment on our code, anybody can comment on our documents, anybody can help us implement stuff. But I think there is some reluctance to be involved, to get too much pressures from large companies. And in fact, we don't need the money because we all work pro bono. Nobody is actually paid. It's only developers who develop specific parts of the apps for a country. They will be funded. But at this moment, all these researchers have been working for nothing. Okay, and we don't do it for the money. We do it for public good. We do have contacts with Apple and Google. This is informal contacts. We just try to align things and make sure that if they come out with an API in the next few weeks, it actually works with our solution. So they published, together with their announcements, they published a design, which is closely aligned with our design, but slightly different. And we're now trying to sort this out and see how we can make these designs compatible. What I didn't mention is that in the US, there is also 2 consortia or 3 consortia that have a similar design, again, with small differences. And so all these consortia, this is more or less the people who signed this letter, the 500 people who signed this letter, the scientists, all this try to align, make sure that if you have a good solution, then you can use the Google and Apple interface. But there is definitely no influence in the sense that they can tell us what to do. But I think we're all in the same boat in the sense that I think actually for Android, I think the improvements are not so firmly necessary. For iOS, we really have a problem. Very interesting. Nobody can roll this out for iOS without the support of Apple. And there is some companies who claim they have a solution and they want money for it, but I've not seen any evidence that this is really the case. And of course, the other problem is maybe you have a solution that bypasses it today and then Apple updates its phones and doesn't work anymore in 6 weeks. So I think, unfortunately, and some people in Europe are now getting very worried about this. Unfortunately, it turns out that we have all a smartphone in Europe. It turns out these smartphones have operating systems which are built in the US. And I think this is a very interesting power struggle. And I think we should actually have our privacy right respected. But I don't think that this app and the Corona crisis is the right excuse to start having this battle. I think we, of course, have to think about this in the long term. But I think what some governments are now doing, trying to convince Google and Apple to help them build a centralized system that also works very well, I think is actually a bad decision.
Got it. Thank you, Bart. I think we also get a bit of questions here. What about the future? Are you also considering other types of use cases for the DP-3T, or is that something that's not really being discussed today?
Well, I would say I hope not. I hope that this is the only pandemic I have to live through. Yep. So I hope that this system, as it is now, will not be used. Maybe it's good to point out that 3 years ago, some of my team members and myself, we published a paper that shows how you can trace your bicycle or your suitcase using a central infrastructure, well, kind of a backbone that doesn't know where your suitcase is or your bicycle. So we actually developed already a system not between 2 users, but between an object and a user. So we developed something similar. By the way, Apple rolled this out. Again, a quite similar solution, but independently last year. So it's clear that proximity will play an important role in the future for certain services. So it's different from location. I think we now understand this. Which objects are near to you is not the same as where is everybody, because it's just the current state of technology, not possible based on GPS to find exactly where objects are. With proximity, you can actually find out which object is within a meter of you or a few meters. With ultra wideband, and this technology is, for example, IMEC has a spin off doing this, you can actually find out which object is within centimeters of you. So I think if this will become very important in the future for our society, but we will not have a system where we have a centralized solution to find who was near to whom. It should be more localized solutions. And so I think this research effort is very good to understand what constraints, limitations are. But it's also possible to do proximity detection in a privacy-preserving way. I think that's an interesting message. And of course, I think as Europeans, we should be very careful how Google and Apple will be deploying the same API maybe for other problems. I think that's something for Europe to pay attention to. But I think if Europe now says to Google and Apple, open this API for mass surveillance, well, then I think that we create the risk that many are going to use for mass surveillance in the future. I think actually governments are taking here really the wrong position. Or some governments are at least.
We are near to the end of the webinar, but if you allow me, Bart, I'm going to ask a couple of more questions because the interaction on both the chat and the Q&A is quite heavy. I think a very interesting question is coming. What is the position? It's coming from Dirk in this case, Dirk de Koning. What's the position of the Belgian government? And also I can see the same in the Q&A. What is the role of the government? So what is the position, as you can see from different governments? You already highlighted a couple of them, like Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Singapore. What do you see is the role of the Belgian government, and what stance do they take?
Well, the Belgian government, I think, I will not say too much about this because I guess some announcement will come in the next days that they're making progress. I think they took a very wise approach. Like any other government, they were flooded with tons of proposals. And they asked people, please hold your horses, because it's also clear that if we roll out an app too soon, or if we have 3 proximity apps, then none of them is going to work. Right? I think that's what they did. You may have seen what the Dutch government did. The Dutch government asked for proposals. They got 200. Then they selected 5 or 6 for Appathon. And then the conclusion was after 2 days, which I could have told me in advance, we can't take conclusions because it's such a complex problem that you can't in 2 days sort out everything, let alone in 5 days make a working solution. Okay, so I think they've been very carefully analyzing the solutions and they're looking at all the aspects. I think you may have heard Mr. De Backer on television saying that he favors a privacy-friendly approach. So I think it's now up to the government to decide from all the submissions they got, which one is privacy-friendly, and I think then take the decision.
Got it. We see here, we have a question. We will now use the app for the good goal of tracing the spread of the virus, but what about shift of borders? All infrastructure can be used in future for less good purposes without people complaining about it because we have used it earlier. So I think you already pointed out to this, that potentially once it's being used and it has some positive effects, it could actually also be used for something else.
Well, it will be this app will be self-extincting. It will die from itself because if people stop uploading keys, the database will be empty after 2 or 3 weeks, and then that's it. The app will be completely useless because it doesn't give you any information anymore. And then probably people will stop sending Bluetooth beacons, right? I mean, it's kind of, will this technology be rolled out? I think, as I mentioned, yes, without any doubt. And I think we should be very careful how it's being rolled out. And I think definitely it's clear that what we will have seen, if this works, that a decentralized approach works as well. And that, I mean, it's clearly what we show is that it's not necessary to store everything in a central database. Yeah. But I think even decentralized approaches can be abused. I think this is also something that our research shows that, you know, if you have enough phones, you can still find out information. If you bring together information from many phones, you can still find out a lot of information. I think it will be very important for our governments to start enforcing the principles of GDPR in a principled way and to make sure that all these technologies are not abused. And I think in general, our governments and our privacy commissions have not been tough enough. Of course, I know it takes time, but I think indeed people realize that location information is actually extremely sensitive information and that we have to protect it in an adequate way.
The final question here from Steve Babbage is, are the identities of infected individuals more at risk in a decentralized system? Because their ephemeral identities are far more widely visible. I think it brings us back to the point, is actually the app useful for its purpose, question mark?
Well, I think Hi, Steve. Glad to see you here or hear you here. I think you should really read the report. I mean, the report was brought out, our report was written, I think, Monday or Tuesday, the security and privacy analysis. It's a very delicate analysis of what can be done. It cannot be done. I think I mentioned in my talk that indeed, if somebody puts up a Bluetooth antenna and a camera and starts spying on their neighbors, it's slightly easier in some settings in a decentralized approach. But I think it's something that has to be balanced. And I think, for example, the secret sharing approach increases the barrier for this. And I think if you really want the answer, you should read the report and then make up your mind yourself. But it's a very long and technical report, but I'm quite sure you're capable of doing that.
Right, and I think that goes for many of the people here in the audience. So thanks for that. I'm going to I launched a small poll, and I'm going to share the results also with you, Bart. So the question was, do you trust distributed privacy preserving and proximity tracing? Basically to see if you made a good evangelism, let's say, of DP-3T. And it seems that you've done a good job, because the majority of the answers, yes, I trust DP-3T. So that's a score that you got. But we do get a couple of people, for instance, it might not be the good one because it won't help with the spread of the pandemic. It provides a false sense of security. But I think you also answered that partially in the last one. One point maybe that you didn't mention is the system being assessed on a regular basis, also DP-3T, by independent researchers, and how could that help? So let's say, can we put some controls over it on top of it?
I think for sure. I mean, I think the nice thing is that it's one of the few apps. I mean, there were a few also in the Netherlands Appathon that are fully open source. People can actually look at the app and can check what it does. And I'm quite sure that if the app gets rolled out, there will be quite some controls on what's happening there as well. And I think also privacy authorities in countries will not let this pass by. They will also carefully watch the rollout, I think.
Okay, Bart, I'd say we'll end it here. Thank you very much for your very insightful perspective and very knowledgeable, of course, as you are on the topic and also different technologies being used. Maybe as a very final one, you said that the work is being done by you and fellow researchers pro bono. Is there a way that the industry and people here can actually support you in these endeavors in whatever means that you could think of?
I think if you have technical expertise or you have people with expertise, they can go to the GitHub and contribute, right? I think also if nations decide to go for something, you can actually offer code reviews, you can help to offer infrastructure reviews. I think these kind of things can be done for sure. And of course, if you see cool applications in your environment in the next years, we're very happy to talk to you to develop those. Privacy-friendly solutions where we still can help you to find locations or find proximity.
Great. All right, I think we'll end it here. Thank you very much again, all of you, for participating and your very lively discussions over the chat on the interest of DLTs and others. Thanks also for the interesting comments and the wider thinking of this. So if you still find that you haven't figured out everything in the explanation of Bart, then you can always have a review of this session. And hopefully we'll see you again in our next couple of sessions next week. And so we'll wish you, in any case, a very good afternoon. And we hope, in any case, to see you again soon without the pandemics. However, as we probably have figured out, it's going to take us some time to recover from this. So have a good afternoon, have a good week, and stay safe. Bye-bye.